Let's begin our discussion of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is often pitted against Kantian ethics because of the emphasis on consequences instead of intentions when we judge moral behavior. Utilitarianism has a long history, and it is a sort of consequentialism because of, as I said, the emphasis on consequences. It's also a form of teleology because the Greek root telos, which means end or goal, is related to consequence and consequences. Let's start with a couple cases that are actually problematic for utilitarianism. One where there's an evil sniper who has a bone to pick with the Roman Catholic Pope, wants to assassinate the Pope, finds out that the Pope is going to visit our college, and sets up shop on one of the tall buildings, waits for the Pope to be among the people and the masses, but the Pope's in that glass bulletproof Pope-mobile, but steps out for a second, and that's when the sniper pulls the trigger. It looks like the sniper's hit the Pope right in his head, but nay, the bullet goes through that big hat that the Pope wears. The Pope is fine. The bullet passes through the hat, hits the ground nearby, doesn't hurt a person, but then something miraculous happens. Where the bullet hit the ground, there's a little crack in the ground, and it starts to grow, and then liquid starts to ooze up, and it's black and strange, and it starts shooting out of the ground, and believe it or not, this bullet has struck oil right in the middle of campus. The sniper scurries off, never to be heard from again. And now the campus is rich because it can sell this oil for lots and lots of money and use it for wonderful things. Free tuition, free textbooks, free pizza every day. Professors get paid a very comfortable, healthy salary. Free student aid, new buildings, new facilities, brand new state-of-the-art equipment for all the teams and all the clubs. So notice that there was a wicked intention, but for utilitarians, we focus not on the intention at all. It says there are consequences, not action. So this is a problem case because the utilitarian would be forced to applaud this action and say, hey, it was morally good. Consequences end up being good. That's all we care about. So the sniper did something good, which flies in the face of our moral intuitions. Here's another case where things don't bode well for the utilitarian. Suppose there were a benevolent researcher who went to some far-off country where a disease plagued innocent villagers and went there and spent years and years studying the disease, trying to find a cure. But after, say, 20 years of devoting their life to this work, basically living impoverished, sacrificing laurels at home and family and friendships, and after 20 years, finally doesn't discover the cure. They tried and they failed. And it just so happens that this researcher carried with them a virus that ends up killing the half of the population that wasn't killed by the original disease. So here we have the opposite of the sniper case. Well-meaning intentions, good intentions, but negative consequences. So whereas we want to say, boo to the sniper, evil sniper, and we want to applaud the researcher, even though you actually made things worse, a Kantian would be able to do that. However, the utilitarian would be forced to, as it were, get the wrong answer in both these cases. We cannot say, boo, sniper. We have to say, good job, sniper, you did something good. And we have to say, boo, researcher, you are a terrible person, you just made things worse. Okay, so think about those cases as we proceed. If you've ever seen this little green guy, then you might be a fan of Star Wars. This is Yoda, Master Yoda, one of the Jedi from the Star Wars saga. And famously, he uttered these words at the top of your screen: do or do not. There is no try. And what did he mean by that when he said them to Luke Skywalker? Luke Skywalker goes off for his training, or he's going to go off and try to fight Vader. And he basically says, I'll try. And Yoda says, are you serious, kid? I'm paraphrasing here. No one cares if you try. This is not A for effort. This is the real deal. You either make it happen or you don't. You save the day and be the hero, or you fail. You do it or you don't. Trying is for naught. Nobody cares. There is no try. Your tries are worthless. So this is the motto of the utilitarian. His line of thinking here is very much a sort of consequentialism. It's the consequences that matter, not the effort. So I already mentioned there's a long history of utilitarianism. The name and the precise versions of the theory come much later, but it has some roots in some ancient Greek philosophy. Epicurus, for example, 2,300 years ago or so. David Hume, we also want to credit with laying the foundation for utilitarianism. These thinkers focused on desire and pleasure, important things to consider when we try to figure out what ought one do and what the good life is. Pleasure and happiness are important. But it really was Jeremy Bentham and his student, John Stuart Mill, that are most often credited with formulating utilitarianism in all its glory. Here's a painting, or a picture of a painting of Jeremy Bentham. So he's an English philosopher from the 18th and 19th century. John Stuart Mill, maybe the key figure in utilitarianism. This was Mill's teacher. And if you've ever seen that ABC show Lost, there's a character named Jeremy Bentham. So clearly the writers and or the producers of that show knew their philosophy. And believe it or not, there is a stuffed Jeremy Bentham at King's College London, I believe. Don't quote me on that. They took his remains and they did some taxidermy, and you can go and visit his sort of Madame Tussauds wax version if you ever make it to the UK. And there is a myth, or there's a, as some will say, sometimes Dr. Bentham or Professor Bentham is wheeled into a philosophy department meeting, and when they take roll and they say Bentham, Jeremy, somebody else will say present, but not voting today. You have a reading from Bentham. Sometimes I cut it from the course, but if you do, here is what Bentham had to say in the Principles of Morals and Legislation. And he's going to focus on pain and pleasure. This is what drives us. If something feels good, then we tend to do it. And if it don't feel good, if it's pain, we don't do it, or we attempt to not do it. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well to determine what we shall do. So what's the basis of moral philosophy? We need to look no further than our moral psychology. What drives us? Happiness and pleasure, pain, and being distraught. Here's John Stuart Mill, 19th century English philosopher. Believe it or not, he's an early feminist. So a lot of people are attracted to utilitarianism because, according to it, everyone's happiness is equal. We all experience pain and pleasure, and thus we're all the same. We're all on equal footing in terms of our moral value. So the prince's happiness is worth no more than the pauper's happiness. A man's happiness is worth no more than a woman's happiness. And we also need to take into account the pain and pleasure of non-human animals. So animal rights activists are often attracted to some version of utilitarianism. Mill literally wrote the book on utilitarianism. It was called, drumroll, Utilitarianism, published in 1863. In it, he writes about the greatest happiness principle, which holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. So it's quite simple. Kant's ethics were very dense, complicated. You need an hour's worth of college lecture to understand them. Utilitarianism, you could explain to a 7-year-old. One difference between Bentham and his students' view on pain and pleasure is that for John Stuart Mill, there is a category distinction, a distinction in kind, not just degree, between what he called low pleasures, which are bodily, instinctual, ephemeral, which means short-lived, instant gratification pleasures, kind of animalistic pleasures, pleasures for things like food, warmth, sex, sleep. Those are different not just in degree, but also in kind, says Mill, not Bentham, from what he called high pleasures. I'll come back to that quote. High pleasures, which are not bodily, which are not animalistic. They're more cognitive, more mental, intellectual, sustaining long term. So when you accomplish a goal after years, that there could be a euphoria, and that could be a mix of high and low, but that accomplishment can stay with you for years. It's something more mental. Unconditional love, and then things that are mentally stimulating, but also kind of fun. Playing chess, brain teasers, doing crossword puzzles, a stimulating conversation. Enjoying so-called highbrow arts, the opera, jazz, poetry, going to museums, classical music. And at the top of the list, Mill puts, no surprise, doing philosophy. So he famously said, "It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Because human beings can experience the high pleasures. And just being capable of that, it's better to be that type of creature than a very satisfied pig who can only dream of low pleasures and doesn't have the cognitive faculties to experience high pleasures. Or if you have to choose between being a fool, someone who maybe has some cognitive deficiencies, who is kind of happy but they're happy not by doing philosophy and going to the opera, they're happy just kind of sleeping and eating and being warm and whatnot. For Mill, it's better to be a genius who's, kind of not totally depressed, but, for the most part, unhappy because of that capacity for those intellectual pursuits. Is Mill correct? That's for you to think about. Utilitarianism, when it gets really refined, leads us to what we will call the principle of utility. So what is utility, by the way? This is utilitarianism, a lot of syllables and an ism there. Utility, more or less, means happiness or pleasure. Not just low pleasures or hedonistic pleasures, but high pleasures too. Sometimes it's translated as well-being. So here is one version of the principle of utility. An action is morally right if and only if, that's what that IFF stands for, it maximizes expected utility with respect to all affected sentient beings taken as a group. So what the heck is a sentient being? A sentient being is a being who has the capacity to experience pain and pleasure. So you and me are sentient beings. Even infants are sentient beings. Even somebody who has complete amnesia or Alzheimer's is a sentient being. And a lot of non-human animals, horses and pigs and chickens and cows and cats and dolphins and whales. What about rats? Sure. What about fish? it gets more questionable. What about bugs? Now it's really a stretch. So there's an epistemological issue about how low down the food chain sentience goes, but we can take our best guess based on the sophistication of their animal psychology. Notice that word expected is in there. That would actually get us out of the jam with the first two problematic cases, because the expected utility of the sniper is bad, and the expected utility of the research is good. So if you take out that word, those two cases are problematic. You put it in, that solves that problem. That's being smart and doing good philosophy. Also, this is not just be selfish. It's not just do whatever gives you an individual pleasure. You have to look at how your actions affect people. You have to look at all the people are affected, how it's going to increase or decrease all those people being affected, including yourself, and everyone's happiness is equal. You look at all the affected people, and you look at them as a group, and you do sort of a calculation. You measure the pluses, you measure the minuses, whatever maximizes results in the most net utility. When you take into account the pluses and the minuses, that's the action that you go with. Let's talk about some problem cases. We've got lots of them. So there's one from Philippa Foot, who's the granddaughter of President Grover Cleveland, although Foot is a British philosopher from the 20th century. She wrote about a famous trolley or the train case. This is one of the most famous philosophy cases of all time, up there with Plato's allegory of the cave and Descartes' cogito, the I think therefore I am thinker. So imagine that a train, or in Britain we might call it a trolley, it's going down tracks, and it's on course to run over an innocent person who's stuck on the tracks through no fault of their own. But there's a switch that we can pull to divert the train down another set of tracks. And so we're going to pull the switch to save that person. But right before we do, we look down the tracks that the train would go down if we were to pull the switch or the lever. And we notice that there is one person stuck down those tracks. So what do? 1 versus 1, you flip a coin. But suppose we switch the case, and this is how Foot described it originally. The train's actually barreling down tracks, and there are 5 people stuck to the track. Again, we don't know who they are. Don't assume that, this one might grow up to be Hitler, this one might grow up to be Einstein. We don't know anything about them. So as far as we know, they all have an equally chance of being a great person. They're all probably average. And are there any babies? Are there old people? We don't know any of that stuff. So for all we know, it's just random innocent people. There's 5 of them. So we want to pull the lever, but right before we do, we realize if we pull it, it's going to send the train down other tracks that will kill one innocent person. So would you pull the lever? If you intervene, then it'll send the tracks down. It will kill one. It will result in the death of one, but you'll save 5. Will you pull the lever? Well, the utilitarian says the answer is clear. You pull that lever. A Kantian, it would be much more difficult. They would say, no, that's using that one person as a mere means to an end. So it's not allowed. But for the utilitarian, it's easy. Pull the lever. And I think a lot of our common sense would say, look, no matter what, at least one person's going to die. So let's go with the case that minimizes the death, right? It's going to be at least 1. Go with 1 over 5. Okay. Compare that line of thinking to a similar case that was conjured up by an American philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thomson, one of the most famous living philosophers today. She writes about what I call a donor case, or the organ transplant case. Suppose a healthy person walks into a hospital for a checkup. And in this hospital, there happen to be 5 innocent people who are in need of some vital organ. Maybe one needs a heart, maybe one needs a kidney, maybe one needs a lung, maybe one needs a liver, and so on. And it turns out that this one innocent person who went in for a checkup just so happens to be a match for all 5 people. And the doctors realize that if they were to harvest the organs of this one innocent person, certainly it would kill that one person. But they are also certain that they could use the organs, transplant them, and save the 5. Do you think it's morally permissible for the doctors in the donor case to sacrifice 1 to save 5? I already know what you're thinking because I ask this question all the time. And when I do the poll, the vote invariably comes out. Most people, if not the vast majority, would say it is immoral for the doctors to intervene without the consent of the patient. Let's assume the patient does not consent to this. It would be immoral to intervene and harvest their organs to save the 5. But does that mean that we're being logically inconsistent? In the trolley case, even though it's not a great scenario, we still are pretty confident that it's okay to sacrifice 1 to save 5. And yet in the donor case, we don't think it's okay to sacrifice 1 to save 5. So what's the relevant difference? If there isn't one, then we're being illogical. So think about that, and you can write about it in your discussion boards. Let's move on to Singer's Oxfam case. So I've got a blurb about that case on the next slide, so let's jump to that. The Oxfam case, or it starts with the pond here. You're on your way to a very important job interview. You are wearing a pair of very expensive shoes that you brought for the interview. On your way, you come across a small child drowning in a pond. You're the only person around who can hear the child's cries for help. You do not have time to get help. You could wade into the pond and easily save the child, but if you do, you will ruin your new pair of very expensive shoes and be late for your very important meeting. So, do you have a duty to save the child? Most people's intuition is that you ought to wade into the pool and save the child. That you have a moral duty to do it, even if it would cost you some, there would be some cost to you. In this case, you'd ruin your shoes. But Singer says we should be consistent. So this is why I call it the Oxfam case. So Oxfam is a very famous charity organization that helps save needy children around the world. The Oxfam letter. In the mail today, you receive a letter from Oxfam, a very reputable organization committed to aiding impoverished children in the developing world, which asks you to please donate $10 to their relief efforts. The letter informs you that about 3 million children die each year from dehydrating diarrhea. But for each $3 that Oxfam receives, they will be able to save one child's life by sending him a packet or her a packet of oral rehydration salts. So by sending $10 to Oxfam, you would be able to prevent at least 3 children from dying soon. We run into these sorts of cases all the time. Now at the grocery store, when you swipe or insert your card, and on the little screen before you sign or click OK or I'd like money back, sometimes it'll say, would you like to donate $3 or $10 to this cause, this noble cause? And I will tell you from my experience, sometimes I do it. But I will be honest, most of the times, no, boop, nope, move on. Life is hard enough for me, move on. I don't want to sacrifice the $3. And, like, as Kant would say, if I always hit no, I don't want to help, that would be wrong. But sometimes it's got to be okay to not help. Because if you always had to help, that would be too cumbersome and burdensome for the average person. So our intuition is that it's okay to not send the $10 to Oxfam. Peter Singer thinks we're being totally inconsistent. We have a moral duty to sacrifice maybe $100 or $200 for the shoes to save one child. Okay, so you're required to spend the equivalent of $200, let's say, to save one child. But then when you're asked not to have to spend $200, just $10, and you'll save 3 children, then all of a sudden we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Slow down. So Singer thinks that we're being inconsistent. What do you think? That's what I want you to think about. So what would the utilitarian say? The utilitarian in the trolley example seems to get the answer right. It's okay to, in the train case, to sacrifice 1 to save 5. Look, at least one person is going to die. What are you going to do? It's just math. In the donor case, utilitarianism seems to get the wrong answer because it would require us to sacrifice the innocent person, harvest their organs. But that doesn't seem right. So we're comparing our intuition versus what the theory commits us to. The theory commits us to harvesting the innocent person's organ, and our intuition is that's immoral. So it's not necessarily a dead end for the theory. However, when intuition, a moral intuition of most clear-thinking, rational, critical thinking people does not align with the commitments of the theory, that's problematic. In the Singer case, Singer argues that the and I know what a lot of you are thinking. Oh, if you see the child drowning, you can hear them screaming. That's relevant. That's morally relevant, and that's why you got to save them. But those children, they're like literally more than 10,000 miles away. I don't even know them, and so I'm off the hook for helping them. So that's the proximity argument. You are in close proximity to the kid in the pond drowning. You're not in close proximity to the children in the developing world. According to Peter Singer, the proximity argument fails. That has no moral bearing or relevance. What matters is the consequences. Are you saving a child or not? It's morally irrelevant how far away you are. I mean, let's say that you see the child drowning, and then you could push a button on your iPhone, and then it would put you on the other side of the world. Would that be an excuse? Oh, I'm sorry, I can save this kid and ruin my shoes, or I just push this button and I'll be 25,000 miles, well, maybe 15,000 miles away, and now I'm off the hook. That wouldn't fly. So why is distance shouldn't be relevant? Maybe we're hardwired psychologically, anthropologically, evolutionary speaking, to take care of people near us. Fine. But is our biology an excuse in this case? Some people might argue, well, we should go with what's natural and go with our biology, but there's plenty of unnatural things that are morally required. Right? Or at least are morally acceptable. I mean, like French kissing, or like when people on the Fear Factor eat those bugs, those things are unnatural, but people would say they're morally acceptable. So there's not a perfect convergence between natural and morally good and unnatural and morally bad. You could argue that it's natural for, I mean, there'd be some controversy here, but it's natural for some humans to want to be unfaithful to their partner and have many partners to propagate the species. You could argue that has some anthropological, biological, evolutionary basis. But does that automatically make it morally okay? A lot of us would say no. So just because it's our natural tendency to take care of those near us and to kind of say, not my problem for those far away, that's not morally a morally adequate answer, at least according to Singer. Let's go on to Le Guin's Omelas case. So Ursula K. Le Guin is a famous science fiction novelist, and she wrote this short story, science fiction story, called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. She got the title as she was passing a city in Oregon. She could see in her rearview mirror the sign, or some kind of mirror where it was written backwards. It said Salem, Oregon, but the Oregon was blocked off, so it just said Salem O. Salem O backwards is Omelas, or at least that's the rumor. And it's similar to a conundrum that comes up in the writing of William James, a famous American pragmatist philosopher, in Dostoevsky's Ivan's Challenge, in the brothers Karamazov. So it's a similar situation. In the story of Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, there's basically a utopia. And if you do a I might have put the reading for our course, but if not, if you just do a web search for Le Guin Omelas, it'll come up. Essentially, it's a perfect utopian society. And you could imagine how you could be your own version of what would be perfect and what would make it perfect. Perfect utopian society. But for whatever reason, this perfection, this utopia, for it to exist, it depends on the suffering of one innocent child. So in the city of Omelas, there is a tool shed in someone's basement, and there's an innocent, like 12-year-old locked in a broom closet down there and is kept alive. They have to eat sludge, and there's a little bathroom bucket for them, and they're just the worst child neglect scenario you could think of. They've never seen the sunlight. They've never experienced love or the loving touch. They're barely alive. But everyone who lives in Omelas, they know that the child has to be there. And if the child were saved and rescued, that they couldn't have their utopia anymore. So the question for utilitarians is, if we could push a button and change our world on Earth to the Omelas world, should we push that button? What would be morally required of us? If we're good utilitarians, it's a no-brainer. We should push that button. Because when you compare the happiness in Omelas, everyone's happy except for one person, compared to our world, where, yeah, there's some happy, but there are a lot of miserable people. And in fact, there have been many, many children that have been neglected, just as bad or worse than the one in Omelas. So we're basically we're minimizing the neglected children, and we're also making the other 7 billion plus of us happy. So it's a no-brainer. And yet, what's our intuition? Our intuition is that the Omelas people are monsters. Their happiness is dependent upon exploitation, and that's not okay. So utilitarianism might get it wrong in that case. Although this is tough, there's a lot of controversy. A lot of students I've had, and you can write about it in your discussion boards, will argue that we should push that button and make this world Omelas. And yeah, it sucks for that one kid, but think about all the children that we would be saving from equally bad or worse conditions. Yeah, so would you live in Omelas? So at the end of the story that Le Guin writes, and it's very beautiful writing. It's just a good example of great creative writing. There are some people who choose to leave because they don't choose to participate in that. So another question is, would you stay in the perfect utopia, or would you leave, go into the unknown abyss? You probably will die, but you'll be alone, or there's people living on the outskirts in kind of desolate desert or something. Would you choose a life of pain just as a protest vote to this child being exploited? That's another question to ask yourself. So that's Le Guin's Omelas problem case. James Rachel, a famous American philosopher from the 20th century, American, I believe, has a case about a peeping Tom. So peeping Tom is an old name, probably a sexist name, for a man who spies on a woman getting undressed. So it makes me think of the scene from Back to the Future, the original, where our hero, Marty McFly, goes back to 1955, I believe it is, to when his parents were teenagers, and he witnesses his father up in a tree with binoculars watching a woman in dress through her bedroom window. Now in the film, Marty's dad falls out of the tree and is supposed to get hit by a car, which happens to be driven by the father of Lorraine, who is the girl being spied on, and that's how they're supposed to meet each other. But Marty gets hit by the car, and then he's the one who gets introduced, and then his mom falls in love with his son, and it's this weird, incestuous, kind of Oedipus Rex, Freudian thing going on in that film. Setting that aside, our tendency is to think that, excuse me, that spying on people, especially when they're, in a, when they're undressing, when they're, indecent, is morally wrong. You shouldn't spy on people, right? But if you're a utilitarian, you only care about consequences. So suppose we set up the case so that we know that Peeping Tom will be able to spy on a woman, maybe lots of women, and we know that they're never going to get caught. We know that the person being spied on is never going to suspect, not even for a second, that they're being spied on. To them, everything is fine. So they go on living their normal life. But the spy, the peeper, as it were, is getting lots of pleasure from this. Arguably low pleasure, but that is to be taken into account when we do our utility calculation. It seems like the theory is committing us to the idea that spying, as long as you know you're not going to get caught, is morally acceptable. And that's a problem case, because even if you're not going to get caught, it still seems wrong. And if we're right about that, then we shouldn't be utilitarians, because according to them, spying if you know you're not going to get caught, or lying if you know you're not going to get caught, or really doing anything that we prima facie, at first blush think is immoral, but we know we can't get caught, utilitarian will usually say, yeah, that's fine, as long as if it's not affecting anyone, or if the net consequences are good, go for it. So that's Rachel's Peeping Tom. Let's go to Nozick's case. So Robert Nozick is another famous American philosopher from the 20th century, passed away when I was in college, and he wrote about what he called the experience machine, which is sort of like the Matrix, or it's like the holodeck in Star Trek, or what the Oculus Rift is becoming, virtual reality. It's a perfect virtual reality machine. It's a machine that if you step into it, you have experiences of things that are virtual, they're not real, they're fake scenarios, but when you're in the machine, you can't tell that it's fake. You can't tell it's a simulation. And Nozick's question is, if you had a chance to step in the machine for good, and then set it up so that once you're in the machine, not only does it pass for reality, but all of a sudden you believe that it's reality. You go in, and once you're in, you don't even know you're in a machine. You just think you're in the reality that you're in. So from that perspective, we could have stepped into the machine already, and we believe our lives are real, but they're all part of this machine. So it could be that real. And let's say that we could program it so that we could have the life we always wanted. All the goals you wanted, you would accomplish eventually. You could even program like a certain amount of conflict and obstacles, and you got to work hard, but eventually you have like a Rocky-like story, and you succeed, even though in Rocky 1 he loses. But that's neither here nor there. A lot of you probably haven't even seen Rocky. That's your homework assignment. Go watch Rocky 1. Actually won Best Picture, believe it or not, and the same director directed Karate Kid 1 and maybe 2. Also a great film. Okay, enough tangents. Would you step into the experience machine for good if you had the chance? Now, most people's answers are no, I wouldn't want to step into that machine. I want my experiences to count. I want them to be connected to reality in the right way. But if you're a utilitarian, who cares about experiences being connected to reality? Pleasure is pleasure. If it's subjectively real, it's real. Just like Morpheus says to Neo in Matrix 1, how do you define real? If you mean sensations being fed to your brain, then the Matrix is real. Depends on what your meaning of reality. If subjective reality counts as reality, then it's real. It's a good philosophical question. The utilitarian seems committed to stepping into the machine, but this does not fit with our intuition. Most people say, no, I don't want to go into the machine. And then finally we end up with the Titanic case. So imagine you're on the Titanic, which we know sunk. So the Titanic hits the iceberg, it's starting to sink. You, as it sinks, you fall off. Like in the movie, you're on a piece of driftwood, except there's no Leo, there's no Kate Winslet. Instead, you're in the water, you're in the cold ocean. You're thinking, I just got to survive long enough for rescue to come. It's going to be tough. To your left, you hear a noise, and you look over, and you see it's a child, and they're not swimming well, and they're probably going to drown unless you help them. And so you're about to swim over to help them. But right before you do, from the other side of you, you hear noises, and you look over, and it's two children who are also about to drown. And if you don't go that direction, they both will drown. So you got to decide. Save the child one on your left or save two children on your right. Well, utilitarianism can help us out. Well, if it's one or two, go with two, right? You can't save them all. But now here's the twist. Imagine that the child on the left is your own child. And the child on your right are two children you never seen them before. They're stranger children. So utilitarianism does not allow us to be biased toward our own loved ones. Everyone's happiness is equal. You can't count your child's happiness as more valuable as another child's happiness that you don't know. So if we go with strict utilitarianism, the right action is save the two, let your own child drown. But our intuition is, of course, it sucks two kids are going to die, but hey, people die, and I'm going to save my own damn kid. That's our intuition, right? That's what we think. But then we can play the numbers game. So instead of save one of your own kids and let two drown, what if it's your own kid versus three kids? And then play the numbers game. 4 kids, 5 kids. How many would it take for you to sacrifice your own child? 10, 20, 50. You can let 50 kids drown to save your own? Now it's like, are you kind of being a dick? And eventually it seems like the number would get so great that you got to let your own kid die. Think about that own number for yourself. I think about it and it's tough. I mean, at some point, 1,000 children, 10,000, a whole nation, 300 million kids. I know, how would you be able to save them all? But you could set it up so that you could do it. You know, that saving, you could make the scenario a little bit more believable that for some reason saving your own, you know, there's a nuclear button that's going to, if it's, you know, your kid is on, your kid is on something that's preventing a button from being pushed. And if the button's pushed, it'll shoot a nuclear warhead and destroy a nation. So, but you got to help your kid. If you don't move them, they're going to die. So you can either move them and save them, but then the button will be pushed. And you can't, people will say, well, I'll be like a superhero and I will just save everything. No, this isn't freaking Avengers. We're setting up the case to be difficult. I have lots of students that try to change the case, and I say, it's great you have this wonderful imagination. Okay, let's talk about your change case where you can save everyone. What's the right thing to do? Oh, I don't know. How about save everyone, right? Fine. Push that aside. We got that answer. Let's go back to my case. You still got to deal with that. So when you change the case, that does nothing to solve the original case. It would be like if you're taking a math test and there's a really hard problem. You cross it off, write 2 plus 2 and then write equals 4. And you say, here you go, professor. I figured it out. No. You know, changing the problem to make it super easy is not going to give you credit for solving the tough problem. So what would you do if you could only save your own kid or lots of others? Eventually, if it's like you can save every human being except for your child, or you can save your child and then everyone else in the world is going to die except for you and your child. I think people would save the world, I would hope, right? I mean, it's going to be the end of our species. Well, I guess not necessarily, but I guess that goes back to that weird Oedipus thing. Okay, just a little bit more. We're almost going to wrap it up here. There is a distinction between different kinds of utilitarianism. What we have been discussing up until this point is often described as act utilitarianism. But it has all these problems that we discussed. So philosophers, instead of trying to throw a theory out, what they will do is try to tweak it and make it better to avoid the problem cases. And that's when philosophers came up with rule utilitarianism. So instead of following the principle of utility, why don't, as this bullet point says, follow the set of rules that, if generally followed, would result in the most net utility. So instead of just having one rule, do whatever maximizes net utility for all parties, all sentient beings that are affected, taken in as a group, we think about really good rules, like don't neglect children, don't be dishonest, don't harm people who are innocent, and that would include, killing and maiming and bullying, etc. So these would be some of our basic rules. And we could compare sets of rules. Imagine we write down, we make a little rule book of what we think the best rules are. And I have my little rule book of what I think are the best rules. You have your rule book of what you think are the best rules. And then we compare them. And the one that wins is the one that, if those rules were followed generally, would result in the best world. So then we've got that. And it probably would have those ones I mentioned. Don't lie, don't kill, don't neglect children. But this philosopher who's very smart, and his last name was Smart, Australian philosopher J.J. Smart, he says, okay, so far this seems to get us around a lot of those problem cases, but rule utilitarianism is still not perfect. What do we do when there's a rule that we're supposed to follow, but we want to break the rule? We can either stick to the rule or we can allow the exception. So, for instance, there's this really cool Star Trek episode of Next Generation with this. You might think, oh, that's Professor X from X-Men. Well, yes, but before he was Professor X, he was Jean-Luc Picard on the Starship Enterprise for Star Trek Next Generation. There's this episode where this young ensign or acting ensign named Wesley Crusher, he's on this alien world, and he's playing the equivalent of catch, and somebody throws it far, and he jumps to catch it and falls into a bed of new flowers that are trying to grow. Don't walk in this area because you'll disturb the plants. And that's against the rule. The rule, don't disturb plants that are growing. And he falls into it and he breaks that rule. He had no bad intentions. And this alien world has no crime, or virtually no crime. And so the Enterprise has gone to investigate and trying to figure out why do they have so low crime. And it's because of their justice system. Their justice system is such that here are the rules, and nobody ends up breaking them because the punishment is the same for every rule, which is death penalty. Now, they don't always kill people who tend to break rules, but they will have zones on the planet. They were randomly selected. Nobody really knows except for a small group. And if that zone is selected and you happen to break a rule in that zone, then you will be punished by death. And even if you broke a rule like keep off the grass, which is what Wesley broke, or a rule like don't murder, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. Doesn't matter what the rule is. And so the crew of the Enterprise, they want to, save their crewmate from being murdered for a crime that it just seems so silly. But the Enterprise has their own morality and their own laws. And one of their number one rule, which is called the Prime Directive, is that you're not allowed to interfere with the morality in alien worlds when you're on their turf. So he's got a dilemma. Do I break the Prime Directive? And, so allow, what it says down there, allow for the exception to the Prime Directive, or do I stick to the rule and then let this innocent kid die, who also happens to be the son of the doctor on the ship, Dr. Beverly Crusher, who has kind of a romantic thing going on with the captain. So not only is it somebody, your crew, but it's also, basically your girlfriend's kid. So what do? Well, in the show, Picard ends up breaking the rule. And he says, look, we can't have rules that are exceptionless. There can be no justice so long as laws are absolute. We got to allow for exceptions, and that's our intuition. So then we went with the exception. Well, if we do that, then rule utilitarianism becomes follow the set of rules that, if generally followed, will result in the most net utility, except when breaking them, when allowing for an exception, would result in the most utility. So basically the rule is follow these rules to maximize utility, or just maximize utility, and you realize that basically just collapses back into the original principle of utility. So if we allow for the exception, then rule utilitarianism is of no use to us, because it ends up just turning back into, it collapses into act utilitarianism, and then we're back to square one with all those problem cases that we mentioned. And if you stick with the rule, then J.J. Smart argues, then you're guilty of rule worship, and then you have problems like Kant had, where you're never allowed to lie ever, even if it would be lying to save an innocent person. Or in the case of the Enterprise, saving your crewmate. If you follow the rule, then you don't save your crewmate, and that leads to the death of an innocent person. So that doesn't seem to be the direction either. So rule utilitarianism, for a short period, did seem like a great alternative to act utilitarianism, but according to Smart, it has problems of its own. Thank you for listening to that a little bit longer than normal lecture. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.